Today's webinar is going to be a little different today than what our regulars are used to. We have the special opportunity to be part of a conversation between New York Times bestselling author and freelance journalist Sam Quinones and the lead for the National Institute of Justice Seized Drugs and Forensic Toxicology R&D portfolio, Dr. Francis Scott. The topic will be Sam's experience while writing his upcoming book, The Least of Us: True Tales of America in the Hopes of Time. True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth, which will be available on Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. In The Least of Us, Quinones chronicles the emergence of a drug trafficking world producing massive supplies of dope cheaper and deadlier than ever, marketing to the population of addicts created by the nation's opioid epidemic, as the backdrop to the tales of Americans' quiet attempts to recover community through simple acts of helping the vulnerable. The Least of Us follows his landmark Dreamland, the true tale of America's opiate epidemic, which ignited awareness of the epidemic that has cost the United States hundreds of thousands of lives and become deadliest drug scourge in the nation's history. Please remember to use the chat to send in questions you'd like to have be part of the conversation, and we'll do our best to address them before the end of today's webinar. And without further delay, I will hand things over to Dr. Scott so Sam and her can start their conversation.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, Sam.
How you doing, Francis? Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for talking with me today. I have to start out by saying that I am a huge fan of your writing. I actually read Antonio's Gun and Delfino's Dream, but somehow I missed Dreamland, which is crazy given my area of expertise. So this opportunity to read The Least of Us was fantastic for me. Can you tell me what sparked your interest in writing about the drug crisis in America?
Well, it really had to do mostly with, you said you read Antonio's Gun and Delfino's Dream. That's my second book that I wrote out of Mexico. I lived in Mexico for 10 years. And I came back from Mexico to the Los Angeles Times, worked for the Los Angeles Times after those 10 years down there. And the drug war famously kicked off in Mexico, very, very savage thing that I had never experienced when I was down there. It was a very, very peaceful place when I was down there. But as part of that, I began to write about the drug war down in Mexico from LA, along with some other reporters. And one of the stories that I came upon was the fact that heroin traffickers out of Mexico were all of a sudden doing bigger and bigger business. And I could not explain that at all. I did not understand why that was, because I thought heroin in 70s, early 80s taught us, that this drug was not worth dealing with, and why would people return to that drug? And so as part of that, I began to work on the story that I later elaborated in Dreamland about this one town in Mexico where everybody comes here to sell heroin, like pizza delivery kind of service of selling heroin. And they had spread all across the country. Even more intriguing to me because why would they find markets for heroin in West Virginia? For goodness sake, I never thought of West Virginia as a heroin town, a heroin place. And so, but along the way, I began to realize that the story was much bigger than that. That I was onto a bigger story that I really knew nothing about, and that was the story of the revolution in pain management that we had embarked on in the 90s while I was in Mexico. That's why I didn't know anything about it. When I started this, I really didn't even know what an OxyContin was, what a Vicodin was. None of that stuff did I really know. And so I had a big learning curve with that was concerned. And so that's really kind of what writing the twin tales of drug marketing, from this one town in Mexico and this other, and the pharmaceutical companies marketing of opioid painkillers as kind of a panacea for all of our pain, no matter what your background or anything like that, is really kind of where I began to, where this began. Along the way, of course, I began to see that this was that the Mexican trafficking world had really grown and understood that there was a new market being created, and they were on it. And by the time I had finished Dreamland and it was out, it was published in 2015, I began to see the first signs of the trafficking world kind of taking over where the doctors had been. Doctors have been the suppliers prescribing these vast quantities of pills. Well, now the trafficking world was saying, okay, we'll take it we'll take it from here. And really then it became a story of synthetic drugs, of how they had switched from plant-based drugs to synthetic drugs. But it really starts with my interest in Mexico and my years down in Mexico, working as a reporter and seeing all that was going on down there, and then being able to use that once I came back up here to the United States in '04.
That is fascinating that you have written so much about this opioid crisis, and yet we're completely outside of when that took off here in the U.S. So you alluded to this. Unfortunately, the drug crisis has not improved since you wrote Dreamland, since it came out in 2015. And so it's understandable there are still more stories to tell, and so The Least of Us needed to be written. But was there a specific story or moment that was the catalyst for you to start on The Least of Us?
I'm not sure there was one specific story. What happened after Dreamland was, to my great surprise, was that we went into my wife and I were we thought we would never, this book would not sell, because I was writing it and there was, nobody wanted to talk to me. What I really found when I was writing Dreamland was like a nationwide silence on the topic. Very hard to find, particularly families who had addicted loved ones and all that. And so that was a real problem. But as the book came out and then spread, I began to see that people became very, very interested in this book. And I began to get more speaking engagements. And what that meant was that I began to then see how invitations coming from all over the country, small towns, professional conferences, on and on like that. It was a startling thing to behold. But along the way, through this travel, I began to see the rest of the country. Actually, I didn't see the country so much as I saw the people. I was in one Hampton Inn after another, basically, and conference and airports and so on. But it was more, it was a strange thing to behold, because I didn't really see anything around me, but I did meet the people, hear their stories. I hugged a lot of people on those speeches, and listened to a lot of stories from medical examiners, cops, recovering addicts, doctors, hospital administrators. I mean, you just go on and on and on. And I met them probably in most states. I think I did like 260 speeches in those 5 years after Dreamland came out. It was just remarkable experience. But from that, I began to see how this all kind of was morphing and becoming fentanyl now, and methamphetamine becoming part of the story now.
You talked about that silence, that national silence, and I think I've seen that as well from my perspective around the painkillers and the opiate crisis. Do you have any thoughts on why we were all afraid to talk about it for so long, and then what changed so that now it is front and center?
Well, it's going to require me being a little immodest, I'm afraid. Initially, what I saw was people were just ashamed that their kids or their spouse or their uncle or whatever was hooked on this stuff. They never could imagine it. First it was pain pills, then it was heroin. And then they were in treatment several times, and then they died in some awful way that they didn't dare put in the obituary. You know what I mean? And so that was a big part of it. That people were so ashamed and so mortified. I think what happened was I began to see this change after my book came out. Other people may have a different view of it. I definitely saw the book have an enormous effect, and the speeches were kind of a reflection of that, I have to say. But as time went on, more and more people began to come out of the shadows on Facebook or at the city council or in churches or talking to the district attorney. And elected officials began to feel that. I would say by 2016, the obituaries were telling the truth suddenly, which had not happened before. All of that was kind of part of the transition that I watched take place between the time the book came out and certainly by 2017 and 18, I began to see a totally different thing than what I had seen in writing the book in 2013 and 14. But a lot of it was because people were just mortified, and because they were silent, they all thought they were alone. And what ended up happening was people began to realize that they were not alone. In fact, that there was many, many people like them in the same situation. And the obituaries, when they began to tell the truth, really resonated a lot. People on Facebook absolutely began to make themselves felt. All of that kind of stuff is really part of what this kind of grassroots coming out, you might say, that's taken place over the last few years.
Well, yeah, so that's an interesting point. You mentioned a bunch of disparate kinds of folks that are now coming together more to try and address this. And your book centers not only on the human cost, but the human response to the beginning of the opioid epidemic, as well as the more recent rise of fentanyl. So the communities around America hit hardest by these drugs individually, you know, in sort of little silos, developed plans to combat the rising levels of addiction and overdose that were similar and different to each other in a multitude of ways. So as you observed these different communities, as you did more of these Hampton Inns and Motel 6s and whatnot, did you see any patterns or specific approaches that were more effective than others as these communities rallied together?
I wouldn't say that. What I would say is that everybody figured out the basic lesson that the opioid epidemic was trying to teach us. And that was that we're better in community. And so what I began to see, certainly by 2016, as I was giving these speeches, and after a while I began to just ask every place I went, was the formation of county, I don't know, they call different things, task force, commission, collaborative, whatever you want. There's a bunch of different names for it. It doesn't matter. What they all had in common, though, was that they were kind of forming real impromptu, and it was no longer just cops and sheriff and judges, parole, probation, etc. It was also clergy, PTA, hospital systems for sure. You would see Little League coaches and that kind of thing, college presidents. You would see neighborhood associations, all these kind of, so you began to see these kind of, for lack of a better term, just coalitions of people forming. And the amazing thing was that I began to see was that no one was asking permission. You know what I mean? It was great. It was, no one was asking for, well, do we have the blue ribbon study that gives us the templates of how we need to present? No, but nobody had that. None. You know, and what they did was just form up. It was beautiful to watch. And because I loved to watch that because of that. Almost by 16, 17, almost every county I went to, there was something like that you would describe in that way. And that was what I thought was the main thing. Not that nobody had a corner on the truth here, or on what exactly they were. Half of it was like stumbling, kind of half blind, you know. Everyone had trouble figuring it all out. There was none of that idea like somebody knows better than everybody else. No. What Americans figured out was the essential, during those years, was the essential lesson of the opioid epidemic, which was we got into this because of our own isolation and destruction of community. And they just kind of, I think a lot of people just felt in their gut. This was kind of an argument too of the book. The book was making this argument that what needed to happen was a return to that, a return to community, a return to kind of getting to know each other, going out for pizza, getting to know the cell phone of the lieutenant, and the lieutenant knows the cell phone of the PTA president, the PTA president knows the pastor, and all that kind of stuff. Those kinds of connections that were actually not very common, surprisingly, even in small counties, were what people understood kind of in their guts that this needed to happen. And I thought that they were kind of learning what I took to be the lesson of the opioid epidemic right from the get-go, that just form up, just do it in a very wonderful American kind of way, not waiting for someone to tell them, you know, oh, this is the authority and we know what we're doing. No, they just kind of figured it out. And again, I love too that they didn't sometimes they failed. That wasn't a problem to me. I thought it was great then, you know, that just failure is part of life. You just move on, you know what I mean? So.
And I liked how you talked about and I have it in front of me, but the jail where they created the new pod, the new kind of accountability, you know, sort of model And it didn't go great right from the start. And they didn't just say, well, never mind, let's go back to the way things
Right.
are. I think there's this understanding that we can't do it the way we've been doing it. We've got to do something different. And so let's figure out what's going to work that's different.
And I think that's one of the things that I did take away, though, that what we really need more than any, I mean, one essential element of this has to be rethinking how we do jail. Jail, in so many ways, is a anchor around our necks when it comes to this stuff. It's so difficult to move forward with jail the way it's been traditionally run. We have to have jail. Even if you legalized every drug that's out there, we would still need a very large jail system, because that's just the way it works. The largest drug that sends people to jail is alcohol. It's cheap and legal, right? So we need to find a different way of doing jail. Though jail now is just a place for people to vegetate. And I learned this early on. I'd kind of been I've been a crime reporter for many years, and I thought to myself, that's just how jail is done. But with the opioid epidemic, again, it was kind of kicking people in the butt a little bit and saying, well, let's try some new stuff, and trying jail as a place for recovery. So pods, building jails, so you have classrooms too. You have classroom space in a jail, which is a rare idea. But you have pods in which people are opt in, and it's up at 8, make your bed, in class, criminal addictive thinking, 12-step groups, NA, time for meditation, time for physical exercise. So you begin the recovery. And I was just lucky enough to happen on one jail in Kenton County, Kentucky, near across the river from Cincinnati. In northern Kentucky, where they were doing that. I was there from the very first day they started. I kept on going back every so often and checking. But it's the opioid epidemic, I thought, was doing that. It was stirring up the pot to such a degree, because it was so serious, because it was so deadly, scary, that people were now turning to new ideas. And this was in the a county this extraordinarily red. It's a red area. These are people who are questioning. They're changing their mind. It's a rare thing in America, particularly with cable news and Twitter and all that. How many times in public do you see people change their minds? It's a rare thing. And I like that these folks, though it was like a very, Democrats don't get elected in that county. Nevertheless, it was, they were saying, this isn't working. Let's see what we can do to do it differently. And now, and again, failing, stumbling, it doesn't, everyone's trying this stuff. I think we need to get away too from the idea that everything needs to be perfect for us to fund it, or otherwise it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. That's not true.
Yeah, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think, the silver lining, if there is one, of the ubiquitousness of this opioid crisis, everybody knows someone who is impacted by the opioid crisis. And right. I think that's probably helped, and you can tell me if you agree, to shift some of the thinking from you're a bad person and a criminal to you're a sick person and we need to figure out how to help you.
No, that's certainly true, Francis. I could tell you this. When I was publishing Dreamland, if you look at the subtitle, it's the a true tale of America's opiate epidemic. The reason I use the word opiate is because nobody knew what an opioid was. I would talk to people about opioids. They would go, "What the hell's that?" They know what. So now, 6 years later, everyone knows what an opioid is. And you're right. I think many people know somebody at work, in church, wherever in the family who's been affected by this. And that has meant absolutely that there's a willingness to rethink what people have thought about addiction. That has also helped. And let me say, and I think that's important all across the country. It's particularly important in white America, though. This has really affected white Americans far more than anybody else, and kind of upset jostled their worldview about a lot of things, criminal justice and all the rest. I would say also, though, that these new ideas about how to deal with a drug problem are also finding their root in the enormous advances in neuroscience that we have had in the last 20 years. I would say really remarkable stuff. You're seeing neuroscience departments at universities form up. Used to be part of psychology. Now you have technology that's able to allow us to understand parts of the brain. Remarkable advances in neuroscience over the last 20 years, I would say. And that too has allowed us a far deeper understanding of brain chemistry when the brain is under the influence of drugs of abuse and other addictive things, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, all that kind of stuff too. Legal stuff, lots of legal stuff, as I get into in The Least of Us. That's a big part of the book as well.
Yeah, that's one of the topics I had to talk about. And one of the aspects of your books that I love is the way you sort of take these seemingly disparate threads and weave them together. And from that, we can take away a more nuanced understanding of the topic. So my world, I tend to only be able to focus on one kind of piece of it. And so this is great for me to be able to get that broader view. And so I found the sections on neuroscience and addiction, including that addiction to everyday legal substances, absolutely fascinating in The Least of Us. And so can you talk a little bit about what neuroscience tells us about addiction and how, in particular, how does that explain that switch from fentanyl to methamphetamine use that you describe in the book that seems so crazy?
Well, let me talk first about the stuff about neuroscience, and we get into meth and fentanyl later in a minute. I just love that stuff. I'm a layman. I'm a crime report. I'm not a scientist anyway, but I just fell in love with neuroscience, and primarily because I had some very smart, very generous neuroscientists that I found to talk with. Nicole Lavina at Princeton, Ashley Gearhart at University of Michigan, David Linden at Johns Hopkins, Tom Gould at University of Pennsylvania. All these folks really helped me understand. And one of the things that just absolutely blew my mind, that I spent a lot of time trying to fully understand, is that drugs of abuse, we have in our brain these magnificent systems that have evolved over eons or millennia, certainly, that keep us alive, that warn us to keep us alive, that warn us of danger, or they tell us to eat, to have sex, to all these things that allow us to avoid getting killed and to procreate and survive as a species. And these things have evolved, as I said, for over so many millennia. And it's just fascinating ideas, how the brain does that for us and what has evolved. The fascinating thing is, I just blew my mind, is that drugs of abuse revert eons of evolution. That's the thing. They take those systems and they turn and they mute them, in a sense. You want to use a modern metaphor, but then also they divert them, they hijack them and divert them into being working only towards the benefit of drug use. So they betray us. Those same systems that protect us and allow us to procreate and all that betray us. So on the drugs of abuse, you generally don't eat as much. A lot of times, what I find most interesting though is that even as death approaches, even as you are overdosing, or even as you are living in a tent encampment on the outside in the elements, you still the body is still not saying, the brain is still not saying, get out of here. This is dangerous. What are you doing? But drugs of abuse do that. And that is an insight that to me influences a lot of what I think. I don't think now that we can wait for people on the street to decide that they are ready for treatment. Hallelujah. You know what I mean? I don't see that. That means that, frankly, there's an implication in that what we actually need to be doing is really finding ways of pushing people, forcing people into treatment. And that's why jail is such an important place to begin recovery. But anyway, the neuroscience was just, magnificent. It was so fascinating. And for me as a layman, but it was that point in particular that kept me up at night going, wow, man, this is what drugs of abuse do. Then, if it can hijack us, if it can brainwash us really like that, what are the implications for policy if that's the case,
Well, and you bring up a great point. So we're all very aware that fentanyl in particular has caused these death rates to just soar, right? It's such a low dose drug to have that impact that it's very easy to overdose, especially with the magic bullets and whatnot that you talk about, this really imperfect, not quality control method that it's incorporated. So do you think that the high death rates had any impact in scaring users away from fentanyl, or do you think that search for that ultimate high had the opposite effect and they're going?
No, I think it depends. It does scare people, the fact that they might die on fentanyl, but once you are addicted to fentanyl, what happens is happened very commonly in the heroin addicted world, and that is you start an overdose is no longer a warning; it's an advertisement. It's that guy's got good dope over there. Let's go get his dope because that fella died, but I'm certainly never going to die. That kind of idea, and so fentanyl. What's happening now on the streets of the country now is that people are now addicted to fentanyl. Their tolerance has risen to a point that would have killed them like a year or so ago, but now they're using it. The problem is that there's no good, safe way for trafficking and for traffickers to ever mix that stuff. And so you may be using fentanyl now and you may be okay, but eventually there's no such thing as a long-term street fentanyl user. That does not exist as did exist with heroin. I met people who've been using heroin for 40 years, methadone clinics all the time, that kind of thing. Those folks can survive because heroin is generally speaking pretty diluted and weak and so on, and so there's not that fear of, or not that threat of death as much, and people can actually kind of live on not great lives, but they can live on it. Fentanyl, that's simply not the case because it's so potent in such a small quantity that you really can never mix it. Be sure that 100% of the time you're going to mix it right, and that means that every time you use it, it's like a game of Russian roulette, basically.
Right, and then you're also playing with your own tolerance levels, like you talked about, because users become tolerant, but it's very easy to slip over that into the overdose and death.
And that's why we're seeing so many people overdose because they just don't have the tolerance for whatever the batch was that they took and whatever that mix was. They just didn't have the tolerance for it. And plus, if you add to that a lot of the analogs we were seeing for a long time, acetyl fentanyl, cyclopropyl fentanyl, carfentanil, that kind of stuff, extraordinary, even more potent than fentanyl. The likelihood of you living a couple of years addicted to fentanyl, I'd say, is minuscule.
Seems like a challenging business model for sure.
In fact, it's not really. It's actually from the business standpoint. If you're just interested in the business of dealing drugs, it's actually a wonderful business model. Killing people does not. Again, if you put for a couple of reasons. First of all, if someone ODs on your fentanyl laced cocaine or fentanyl laced methamphetamine, then that means more people are going to come to you for what you're selling, because again, it's not a warning, it's an advertisement, right? But also, if you are selling, let's say you're selling cocaine or methamphetamine, if you start lacing those with fentanyl, pretty soon you've created a fentanyl addict from what was a stimulant consumer. And if stimulant consumers don't buy every day, an opioid addict must buy every day to keep those withdrawal signals away. So in fact, lacing it with a drug that might kill the customer is not a bad business move. It's actually smart business. It's cruel, it's diabolical, it's crazy from our perspective, but on the street world, it actually makes a ton of sense. And if you add to that the fact that these drugs now, because they're synthetic, they can be produced year round. If you have the chemicals, which they now do in Mexico because they have ports where these chemicals can come in, You can add that stuff to almost anything. It's so cheap to boost your cocaine with fentanyl. It's so cheap to boost your meth, which is already pretty cheap with fentanyl, and get an addict, an opioid addict, from a stimulant user.
Well, so we have a couple of questions from the audience, and one of them is relevant to this. Tammy asked, do you think most drug dealers are also drug users?
Very often, yes, but not always. Yeah, I would say that frequently, particularly as you go farther down towards the street, the folks who are frequently selling it in in minor smallish quantities, those folks are almost always paying for their habits, and they also have a whole network of people around them. I was just out in Eastern Tennessee, where there's Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, where there's lots of, like big hotels. It almost looks like Disneyland. Well, the folks who work in a lot of those places are, waiters and maids. I don't want to cast aspersions too far, but the truth is a lot of those folks are working for their dope. And then there's people one leg up, who probably are addicted as well. But then when you get up another couple rungs on that supply chain ladder, it's unlikely, I would say. Certainly the folks out of Mexico are not probably using fentanyl and methamphetamine. I can't see that happening.
So in The Least of Us, you discussed a previous brief and deadly rise of fentanyl use in California, with fentanyl coming from China in the late 70s. And then it disappeared. And what do you, we weren't seeing it. So what do you think caused this 40-year hiatus in trafficking fentanyl?
I'm not sure. I think you may be confusing stuff. There was in the 1970s, there were a few small outbreaks. I don't think they came from China.
Okay.
They didn't come from China. They were I don't think anybody ever knew where they came from. But this was the nature of fentanyl. Fentanyl is, by the way, a magnificent drug. People need to understand that. If you are in surgery, I had a heart attack. They gave me fentanyl when I was in the hospital. Magnificent. It's revolutionized all kinds of anesthesia and whatnot. But in the street world, of course, it's by underground chemists, which were probably the source of all that. The key moment, I think, in all this story comes in 2006 with the fentanyl story, and that is when a lab, 2005 and 6, when a lab in Toluca, Mexico, outside Mexico City, is funded by the Sinaloa cartel, using a chemist who had been he's a Mexican citizen, but he was living in the United States. Learned to make fentanyl up in the United States in the 90s, went to prison, gets out, was deported. They contact him and say, hey, you're a pretty good chemist, we hear. Would you like to start a lab? They initially wanted him to make ephedrine, because they saw the Mexican government beginning to crack down on that. And ephedrine, of course, was at the time the source of all methamphetamine manufacturing. He says, yeah, but what he really wants to do is make fentanyl. And so he, unbeknownst to them, kind of crazy, I thought, considering who he was dealing with, he starts making fentanyl, and they don't know what he's talking about. They actually get a little bit angry at first, but then he explains to them the enormous profit potential for having a synthetic form of a kind of a synthetic heroin. And it gradually dawns on them that this guy is showing them the way to riches that they never imagined, right? And so he starts making his fentanyl in this lab. The fentanyl starts making its way. The Sinaloa cartel has pretty much a direct hub in Chicago. It makes its way to Chicago, from Chicago to Detroit, St. Louis, out to Philadelphia, Camden, etc. And all along the way, you see this enormous eruption of death. Several thousand deaths took place, all connected to this one lab's fentanyl that was then being sent up to the United States. The lab is busted in 2006, and all those deaths gradually stop. And then what begins to happen is, the drug underworld in Mexico is very aware by now of the opioid epidemic and the market that promises, and they are following it. They don't have anybody who can actually make it for them right off the bat. And then the Chinese chemical companies get in the mix. And they start selling the stuff, and the Mexicans begin to buy from them. That's the first place where they began to get large quantities of fentanyl, was from China. But along the way, of course, they learn how to make this stuff, which is what the situation is now. And so China has really cracked down on fentanyl itself, but the chemical companies still sell the ingredients, the precursors and all. And so Mexicans begin to buy from them the precursors and make it there. And that is where we find ourselves today. That Mexico really is the source of most of our fentanyl now, because they figured out how to make it. And of course, as many of you may know, they're now not just making it in fentanyl powder, but they're doing a kind of a value added play. Instead of selling just fentanyl, they're selling counterfeit pills that look like prescription pills that really contain fentanyl. And these are oxycodone generic 30 milligram pills. These are Percocets, what other ones? Xanax, Adderall. There's some others. They have mastered the pill manufacturing, understanding that there's a lot of people who are addicted to pills up here in the United States because of the opioid epidemic. They can't get their pills as easily because we've cut back on prescribing, and they begin to supply those folks. I think also, though, what's fascinating about all this is that let me say that the underworld has never been able to take advantage of our American love affair with pills that dates back to at least to Valium, you know what I mean? And so, only pharmaceutical companies, we view pills as this kind of safe, solution to all our problems. You take it out at a party, no one's gonna be aghast. Or if you took a baggie of heroin out, everyone would be like, what the hell are you doing? We have this love affair that's kind of about convenience, solves all our problems, et cetera, all these things. Great. Okay, fine. The underworld has never been able to take advantage of that in any meaningful way until fentanyl. Fentanyl has allowed them to produce all these pills and it just is a remarkable thing to see the amounts of pills that they're now producing that are making their way all across this country, because they have distribution all across the country right now. And it's for the first time, an underworld has been able to take advantage of our love affair with pills, and do so, let me phrase this correctly because it's a delicate thing, but do so with more or less professional mixing. The problem is that what has happened now is that so many people got into making pills that a lot of people who initially the pills were remarkably consistent, 7% or something like that of pills were it was like, what was it, 2 to 7% fentanyl, something like that. Mm-hmm. Now it's way off, and now there's all these people who don't care, and they're just getting into it, and they're saying, forget it, I don't care, so I'm doing it, But that's really the situation now. They've really been able to take advantage of that. I think it's a fascinating thing. And now, of course, the pills are in the millions. In the 2017, you're talking about a few tens of thousands, maybe 50,000 or something like that. People would seize. Now it's, so far, DEA just announced 9.5 million seized so far this year. That means another 90% are getting through, something like that.
And so do you think it's ironic that this all started like in Dreamland with the opiate crisis, with pill pushing, with the pharmaceuticals and the legal medical route, and then we've seen what happened. I mean, we as a society have seen what happened, and yet it has not slowed our love affair with pills. So now we've come full circle, and now we're just getting it, like you said at the top of the hour, from the drug dealers instead of from the.
All of this is the story of the agony you create in the search of a pain-free life. And pain is part of life. Nobody wants life mangling pain. Of course, that's not the point. It's that so often doctors prescribe this stuff, and in refills too, for people who really didn't need it. It's just, and that opens a Pandora's box that's very difficult. Now our options are very, very limited, right? We don't have the options that, I do think though that some of the great lessons I guess you'd say. One of the great lessons of the opioid thing is that we all need to really see how we can change the way we live. It's calling on us to change, to really rethink how we live. I saw this, I felt this very clearly as I was doing my Dreamland book, and so now I don't drink soda. I basically don't shop in the center part of the grocery store at all. I mean, rarely buy stuff there. I get lots of exercise. I was swimming just before I came on with you guys. I get to walk a lot. I think it's important to think about a simpler life, right? Big houses. Why do we need enormous houses where we don't even see our kids? They're all the way at the end of the house, that kind of thing, To me, it really is, getting back to what is natural for us, meaning what we evolved to be. We evolved to be in community, right? We evolved to be around other people. Back in the caveman days, had somebody decide, well, I'm going to be a loner, that guy is going to die very, very quickly. And so will that attitude, will die with him, And we evolve best together, when we're together. We evolved to not eat cruddy, hyper-refined food. We're finding neuroscience is fascinating, showing us how all of what we're doing is the stuff that we're eating is very much like dope. The fascinating at Princeton experiment on sugar-dependent rats. I couldn't get over this one. This was fascinating, where they have this group of, this is back in 2002 or 3 or something like that. They have this group of sugar-dependent rats, and they give the rats naloxone. Right now, a heroin addict goes into withdrawals. You give them naloxone, goes into withdrawals, gets pretty feisty some of the time too. And because that drug all of a sudden is saying, I want more, and it's dominating the brain pathways of that person. Well, the rats on sugar went into, given naloxone, went into withdrawals. They're like, shivering and shaking, do a lot of like grooming and all this stuff. I was just blown away. So sugar hits the same pathways as heroin, maybe not quite as powerfully, but nevertheless. It's an amazing thing to when you get into understanding that. And I frankly don't believe we can spend enough on neuroscience research right now. I mean, I just think you just open up the bank accounts, because it is such an important thing to understand, because the more we understand, the better the policies will be. And we won't be going down blind alleys without really knowing where we are.
Well, I was hoping you were going to talk about that, because that was one of the things that completely struck me when I read the book. And I have a family member who is like a sugar addicted rat, but I was like, hey, come here real quick and let me Narcan you and see if you go into withdrawal, because I'm concerned about your soda addiction. So
but I think that's a big part of the whole story, and also I have to say, supply is the thing, No one ever got addicted to a drug he or she did not use and has no access to. But also the neuroscience is showing us, the more you have, the longer you're using, and the greater the potency, the more likely you're going to be addicted for a long time. And the more likely too, you will find other things to be addicted to. It's like your brain will be rewired to want to be kind of hijacked. In a sense. To me, all of this comes down, really, I have to say, to supply. I know that that's a controversial thing today, because we want to get away from supply reduction or reduction. To me, once you understand the neuroscience a little bit, to me, that it's very clear that has to be a major focus, particularly because we are right next to a country which has perhaps the most sophisticated, capable, moneyed, and ruthless drug underworld on the entire planet, and they are constantly thinking like a consumer product corporation. I think, even though they're not a corporation, and it's very diffuse. We talk about cartels; these are not cartels per se. I mean, cartel is something. It's an organization that forms to restrict supply to force price up, but that's the opposite of what's happening with fentanyl and methamphetamine, right? There's no control on supply. It's just huge amounts of stuff coming through our ports these days.
Well, I want to get back to what you've talked about a couple of times. You've touched on the community aspect of this too, in addition to supply reduction, but in terms of countering addiction, this community aspect. And so we have in the chat, and I have as a question for you, and you mentioned it in the book, that you were wrapping it right as the COVID-19 pandemic started. And it's like we just figured out we need to be in community, and now we've forced addicts into isolation again. Have you been able to catch up with any of the subjects of the book to see how?
No, I mean, people are having a tough time. Yeah, a few folks have not done well, but it's a complicated story though too. On the one side, on the kind of negative side, you see people are, we went into the pandemic. The really scary thing is too, the sad thing is that we went into this pandemic just as the drugs, these two drugs, meth and fentanyl out of Mexico, had hit probably their highest, most prevalent point. So it's more dangerous than ever to be isolated, and here we are in a pandemic in which folks are isolating. You know what? Can I just interrupt myself one quick second? I do not have my power plug, and I'm running low on juice. Can I take like 1 minute? I'm going to go get my power plug, and I'll be right back. Very, very sorry to do this, but I'm afraid I'm going to kind of lose you in a minute. Hold on 1 second.
No worries.
While we're waiting on Sam, I figured we'll take this as a good opportunity to remind everybody in the audience, please continue to send in questions. We've got plenty of time to continue to ask Sam questions related to his book and his experience and everything. So do not hesitate to put them in there, and we'll make sure that we pass them along to Dr. Scott and Sam.
Yeah, and I'm definitely, Ansel, I kind of want to save your question for the end, just because I think it's a nice way.
I am so sorry. That has never happened before. And I was afraid of just kind of blinking right out on you guys. I apologize for that. Anyway, high technology. But I would say about the COVID thing that there's all these reasons why it's very scary, right? And it's a step back, certainly at least one step back from the progress we've been making. But the pandemic, I think, also is teaching us some very important lessons that the opioid epidemic was also teaching, except for it's teaching in a much more widespread way. And that is the importance of community. Once we lose it, I think what we're seeing is so many people, we kind of took it for granted. Now you don't have it. It's something we all want because it's part of, our core, I think. Certainly our brains are built that way. And so to me, this is really an essential, part. I would say that it's a good part of the pandemic, if there is any good part of it. I don't know, maybe there is, but I'm hoping it will have showed us all the importance of community, how we really have a tough time when we're not around others. And what if that was the overriding theme, in my opinion, of the has been of the pandemic, that we're so much better together. The other thing is, it taught us, I believe, I hope, the importance that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable. We're only as strong as that meatpacking worker in Kansas, essential worker, all of a sudden we discover. Or that grocery store clerk who may or may not have health insurance, but comes to work anyway. It's the idea that was getting, that it struck me at first. I was trying to figure out how this connected to the book that I was writing, then began to realize actually this is right in line, because it's showing us that those folks that we maybe have taken horribly for granted all across the country, like those meatpacking workers, they're essential workers, we're told, are so important. And that the idea being that we're only as strong as the most vulnerable among us. We're only as strong as a community, as a country, as the least of us, right? And so that is also, I have to say, the lesson of the pandemic. It's not just that, we took a big step backwards. We did, no doubt. But there's more to it if we'll learn and we'll understand it, and that we want to be around other people. We need to be around other people. It is unnatural for the human being to be isolated, and that is where we were as a culture. The opioid epidemic was showing us all we were doing wrong. You destroy community. You're all alone. You eat crappy food. You want miracle cures for problems that you could solve if you just exercise more. These are kind of the lessons that the opioid epidemic was teaching. I think the pandemic has kind of reinforced a lot of that.
Sure, and it's made the rest of us sort of crave community in the way that, and connection in the way that, a smaller way maybe, but the way the addict craves that drug.
Yes, I think so.
Throughout The Least of Us, you wove this line of hope throughout these really grim tales of abuse and hardship. And so, and you've done it today as well. Why was that so important for you to highlight in this book?
Because, well, first of all, I'm a human being. I mean, you write a book about death and destruction, depravity, the worst of human nature, period, the end. Like, I don't want to even read that myself, so that's number one. But also because I feel that I was very close to kind of the grassroots level on this book, and Dreamland too, for that matter. And I began to see that was the story, that people, once you get down there, it's people not caring so much about the political polarization that Fox and CNN live from, and Twitter lives from, that kind of, and that also, that once you got down there, it was just people working. They understood the basic stuff, which was that it's not miracle cures. It's not one pill for every kind of human being. It's daily work, working on stuff that is very unnoticed, that's small. It's not sexy, it's just the daily work. That's why I wrote in the story about Muncie, about the tool and die shops, that they spent their whole time, making infinitesimally small improvements to a product. That's how you get to a stronger society. That's how you get to a better made car. That, it's that kind of thing. And so in Muncie, told the story of Bird, the guy who lived in this neighborhood where the transmission plants went out of business, and as their neighborhood falls apart, they're about to close the community center. It's really the center of life there. He holds on to a key, and even though the city believes that the thing is closed, he's actually the place that he opens it up for all the kids, for the old folks to play euchre, for the guys to play basketball. It becomes, as the center of community life, as all of this is falling apart. Bird, this fairly strange fella who never sees a doctor, drinks endless sodas and eats junk food, and eventually dies of a very treatable, probably treatable cancer, saves the neighborhood in a sense by just going out there and do it himself, opening this thing up. He mows the lawn, he fixes the toilets. It becomes his project to keep that center going when the city has cut budget and figures that it's just locked up. It's that kind of story, It's the woman who removes tattoos from folks getting out of jail, including the tattoo that amounts to a brand put there by her pimp from the inner thigh of this one woman. It's churches who in Clarksburg, West Virginia, who have been devastated by deindustrialization and departure of people, and now barely hanging on. Their congregations are 15, 20 people, and very scared of all these homeless, meth addicts all around them who are acting very weird. But when polar vortex comes and the temperatures begin to drop to points where these homeless meth users are going to be will die, these churches find a renewed rejuvenation, in a sense, by opening their doors to these very, very strange people that the congregation's definitely scared of. But they find new life, these churches, from thinking in turn beyond the four walls, as if the congregation is the entire town, And it's the sheriff, box watching, buzz cut, chewing sheriff who comes to understand that some of the stuff he's been doing isn't quite working, and he needs to spur the community, find work for recovering addicts, and he himself offers a job as a janitor at first to one of the most notorious addicts in the entire county that he's arrested many, many times. And then that guy becomes the dispatcher for the county. It's like these kinds of stories were so exciting. You know, the stuff that people want to talk about this book, or meth and fentanyl, to me, the most exciting stories are I filled half of the book with them. Stories about these places where you find these tiny, tiny little stories, tiny little tales, completely unnoticed if I hadn't written them. And it's from those stories, I think, not to say this is what you need to do. This is not a prescription. This is not a template with bullet points of what you need to do. It's more like an approach, an attitude. Don't worry if you're not saving the world. Work in the small ways. Get to know everybody around you. Be kind of part of a community again, which is kind of what we had and we got away from the last 40 years, if you ask me. All of that is kind of part of that. That's, to me, is the stuff that really moves me. You know, the drug stuff is very sinister. I could talk forever about it. I know a lot about it, but the stuff that moves me are these small, the smaller the better. That's why I set myself we got into this because we wanted a magic bullet, big, sexy answer for all human pain, very complex, having to do with the brain central nervous system and all that. And we need to move away from that idea. We can't be involved in that. We need to move away towards what the tool and die guys were doing, towards what Guy Bird was doing in Muncie, Indiana, towards what the sheriff was doing in rural Ohio, finding small ways to make a difference and coming out of the shadows and knowing each other again. And I think for so long, we've not done that. And the opioid epidemic, and I think the pandemic too, to a certain degree, showed us the problems that we create when we do that.
Sure. Well, I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but we have a couple of questions from the audience that I want to get to. Nicole asked, with the rise in the legalization of recreational marijuana and the different ways you can use and get the drug, do you foresee this being a new avenue to get fentanyl out into the community? It's
very possible. It's happening. I would say rare occasions, but it's definitely happening. I would say this, in the age of synthetic drugs, there's no such thing. Synthetic drugs are now on the street. We've had synthetic drugs for years, but nothing remotely close to the potency and the threat and the prevalence of fentanyl and meth as we have it today. So those two drugs mean that we have reached the end of recreational drug use in America. People die of cocaine overdoses, which really are just fentanyl overdoses all the time. This is a big part of the death toll, I think. There's, all what we used to laugh about, scoff. Oh, I used to do this too. When we watched those old movies about the dangers of drug use, and back in the 70s and 80s when I was coming up, these were all laughable. I laughed at them because they were laughable. All of those myths have become reality. One hit of heroin will kill you. Same with a line of cocaine. Same with a line of meth. The hyperpotent pot will send people in psychotic episodes to the ER. It's like we have the myth is and the reality are now the same. And given what we know about neuroscience and how completely these drugs damage the brain and control the brain, that means we need to rethink a lot of the policy implications, and it's forcing us to do that slowly. But I definitely think that there's nothing stopping. Let's put it this way, in answer to the question, there's nothing stopping the underworld, from the street dealer on up to the folks in Mexico or wherever, to use marijuana as a delivery vehicle for fentanyl.
Sure, in the same way that you were talking about it being laced into the cocaine and the methamphetamine, and now you've got an opioid user instead of a stimulant user. So
makes total business sense, and don't think that people have some kind of moral compunction against doing it.
Absolutely not. So I think the final question that I want to end with, Antonella asks, what are your future projects and goals to write about or advocate for?
Oh, wow. Well, I don't consider myself an advocate. I want you to know that. I'm a reporter. I don't advocate I'm not an activist. I write stories, and I think the stories reflect where the country is on this issue or that issue, but I'm not I'm not an activist. I'm not an advocate per se. Okay. I want to write a few. There's several projects I want to work on. One is a biography. In my first book, I wrote a story about the pioneer of the narco ballad out of Mexico, who wrote ballads about narco traffickers, and he was murdered in '92. He's got quite a fascinating life. I would like to write his biography. I'm about a third into that project, actually. At some point when my times in the LA Times, I began to write about in the Mexican community in LA, how young people were really enthralled with the tuba, and so I began to investigate the tuba world, and there's like two worlds. There's Mexican tuba world, there's the non-Mexican tuba world, kind of classically trained and all that. But each story is fascinating. And so I may end up writing a book about tubas and tuba players. I've interviewed most of the big tuba players in the world right now, so I might do that too. I don't know. And then there's another story that I want to write that I truly love. I wrote kind of up in a small magazine piece years ago about the way that the first Chinese Mexican beauty queen in Mexico was selected using as a measurement, whoever could collect the most Pepsi bottle caps. It's a true story. It's out of Mazatlan, and it's also about the coming out of the Chinese Mexican community, because for many years they were greatly marginalized, beaten, deported, exploited, and so on. And her coming out, this young woman named Isela Wong, back then in 1961, if this was her selection as beauty queen of Mazatlan for Carnival, was this major moment of kind of the Chinese community kind of not being hidden and quiet and all that bit, but kind of coming out. I want to write a kind of a young adult fictionalized version of that story. So we'll see. I'm interested in everything. There's almost nothing that can't be, I think, fascinate me. And so who knows? That's why I love being a journalist. It's magnificent. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm headed in the future, I suppose.
Well, that's quite a mix, as usual. So thank you, Sam, for sitting down with me. Thank you for bringing these beautiful little stories that we wouldn't see, that we wouldn't know what was happening with a sheriff in Ohio if you hadn't brought them to us in The Least of Us. So I hope everyone will enjoy your book when it comes out on Tuesday.
Thank you very much, Francis. Great questions. Really appreciated the conversation. Really wonderful. And thanks to you all for sticking in. Sorry about my electrical problem there a minute ago, but really great talking to you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Francis. Thank you so much for letting us be a part of, such an engaging and honestly critically topical conversation. So just to give everybody one more reminder to the audience, The Least of Us comes The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope of Time. True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth comes out on next Tuesday, November 2nd, online and in your local bookstore. And don't forget to check out Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic as well. Before you leave today's webinar, we ask if you could participate in a short 5-minute survey. You will see a checkbox icon directly above the chat. Simply click that button to be linked to the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback about our webinars is critical information that helps us improve and continue to provide you the best webinar experience possible. If you could please take those few moments to complete the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to all our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, a link to our website at forensiccoe.org, and a link to listen to episodes of the FTCoE's podcast, Just Science. There's also a link to sign up for the FTCoE newsletter so you can stay up to date with everything that FTCoE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.